It's great to be with you all. It's such a big audience. I think it's the biggest one I've spoken to. I'm going to start today with a project that I'm working on now. It's coming out as a book soon, but it's all from 1981. I had moved to New York in 1977 when I was 26 years old. I had studied in Boston, and after finishing college, I moved to Mississippi, where I'm from, lived with my parents, worked as a waiter, and then after 2.5 years, I couldn't take it anymore. I was just too bored and frustrated living in in a small town, in an isolated place. Some of my closest friends had been there but moved away. And New York was the place where I then knew the most people, because a lot of my close friends had moved there from Boston around the same time that I was moving there. In the 70s, I was photographing both in color and black and white, and mostly black and white in Mississippi. And in this year in New York, I had lived at a couple of other addresses, and then moved into this apartment and lived with this friend, Butch Walker, who was also from Mississippi, a small tenement walk-up apartment, 5th floor in the West Village. And the light was good in that apartment, and we started having brunches a lot, inviting our friends over, and it was kind of an excuse for me to photograph people in the strong available light in color. I had used an on-camera flash earlier in black and white, and then I'd stopped, and I wanted to do everything in an available light after that. It was more expensive, and I was on a budget. Butch and I were both working, cleaning people's apartments. I didn't want to have any kind of full-time job that would distract me from being able to photograph as I wanted to. And the rent was cheap. It was only $175 a month for me. And, I had free time to go and visit my friends and photograph their lives. A lot of them were artists. It was very exciting to me to move to New York and realize that I could have such a circle of friends, of artists and creative people, writers, actors. That's me photographing Nan Golden that year. Remember that this is all in 1981. But color was a little bit more expensive, and I had to process it at a lab. I would get back 4x6 prints, little prints, instead of contact sheets, and I would shuffle through those and initial ones that I particularly liked, and I would give them to my friends to do the same. I want to talk as much as I can about process and intention in this talk. So I studied, I think my first photo class was around 1972. When I was a student, I couldn't get into the photo classes that I wanted to take. So I had to find a place off campus, outside of the university, to study. And at the time, Henry Hornstein, who created an instructional manual on photography after that was a bestseller and has been reissued many times. He was my first teacher. He was just a graduate student at the time. And his big emphasis in photography was to photograph what you love. In fact, he wrote a memoir a couple years ago called Shoot What You Love, I think is the title. And surely I love some of these friends. But I think that there are more complicated ways to think about what you choose to photograph. And I think that choice is the hardest thing in photography. It's like what you're going to photograph is much harder than any kind of technical thing that you can learn. Figuring out among all the millions of possible things what it is that you're going to photograph. And then I think sometimes it's about not what you love, but what you want to understand, or what you gravitate towards, or what you identify with, or what you interrogate because something is a problem and you want to understand it better. In this case, I think that this idea that I was finally in this kind of artist bohemia, this community of creative people, was something that I was still trying to understand in myself, because I didn't take photo classes until I was about 20. And before that, I identified as more academic. That's me. Actually, it's the only picture in this group, not in 1981, it's in 1982, and it's taken by Frank Franca. So I think in these pictures, I'm looking at surrogates of myself. They're not just kind of self-portraits. They're also, other people who are interesting to me, that are really interesting to me. And wanting to understand them and seeing them as a reflection of myself, seeing us all as connected in this sort of downtown art scene and this certain community at a certain time. I remember this day going to Jones Beach, and the idea that I would have this many friends to go somewhere with, this many friends that I respected and admired and appreciated, and some of whom I was attracted to. And that was kind of a big deal coming from my more remote, rural, isolated childhood and upbringing. I was driven by this sort of pursuit of understanding my identity as an artist, in a community, in a given place. And then you have to think about what is the look that you want your work to have? What is the form it should take? My style is, I would say, heavily influenced by film. I mean, I was saying that I thought I was an academic for, until I was in college, but in the back of my mind, I wanted to be a filmmaker, and that sort of came forward when I got to college, and I took classes in the history of film. And I went to see movies all the time, making up for all the ones that I couldn't see when I was growing up, and particularly foreign films. The filmmakers that really impacted me the most were the Italian filmmakers of the late 50s, early 60s, who were referred to as neo-realist, and particularly Fellini, Visconti, and Antonioni in that period. The aesthetics of that group had started out in a kind of documentary mode where they would shoot in real locations instead of the studio and use non-professional actors and tell gritty stories that were less glossy or stylized. And then by the late 50s, they'd all become proficient, and they'd gotten into more stylized expressions of their aesthetics. And that's the period that I'm really influenced by. I mean, in film, you have moving figures. In a lot of these films, they're moving through interiors, and the relationship between them, between figures themselves, between figures and doorways and windows and furniture, all of that context surrounding a figure and the figure's relationship to it creates this kind of mise-en-scène that is at the heart of what I do. And it's also the hint of narrative when you create those spatial constellations with figures. This looks like a collage, but it is one frame. It's just that that white wall was spray painted by the artist whose loft it was. the tension between foreground, background, middle ground. I mean, in New York, a lot of spaces are too small and claustrophobic and exasperate me because of that, because I want more space to compose in. And I love the beach because it offers that space, and then you can see figures more clearly. And whereas in some of the earlier pictures, you could talk about the idea of portrait like this, I think, I began to favor mood and atmosphere over the information that you would find in the face. So the figure, I think of the figure, the observed figure, as opposed to a portrait figure. Generally, they're not looking at me, and it's as if I'm a fly on the wall. And so I call them observed figures. And I love having a whole figure in there, but, with figures, besides the relationship to each other, which creates some kind of psychological implication, there's a question of gesture and stance and what that means. And, that's what I was looking for. I mean, in this case, we're in a studio that gives me a little bit more space, and I can get back and get the whole figure of my friend Jody on the left. There's certain people who appear more than others, and they're kind of like protagonists driving the body of work. For instance, both of these guys were really close friends of mine, and they were lovers of each other. I photographed them a lot. I photographed this artist a lot, Frank Moore. The reason that I'm doing this book now is nobody knows this work. Only a couple of these pictures were shown in a solo show in 1985 in New York. And maybe those same ones were published in a Japanese magazine in the late 80s. And otherwise, nobody, including my gallerist, knows the work because I made it and then left it behind. I went from this to black and white. I photographed mostly in black and white through the 80s. And by the time I really was showing in the 90s, I had so much new work that I just sort of left these behind. But last year, the Swiss artist who I had met during a residency in Rome decided she was going to do a series of photo shows in her studio in Zurich, and she asked me to show, and I could show whatever I wanted to. And I had just had a conversation with a young person from Zurich who happened to mention that he was really into the 80s and that all of his friends were really into the 80s. And it made me think back to this body of work, and I thought, wow, I really should look at that work. Maybe that's what I should show. And that will be interesting to that younger generation in Zurich that I don't know. Also, because some of these artists have become famous in the meantime. But the thing about this period also is that a lot of the people in the picture, a lot of the men in the pictures have died. They died of AIDS, anywhere from around 1986 to 2002. Some of them are still alive, though, including this one in the foreground, George Stoll, who's an artist in LA, very successful. The woman with the straw hat is Katie Noland, who at the time was very social and gregarious, but at a certain point in the 80s, she stopped seeing all of her friends and started concentrating on her work and staying in her studio, and she made this body of work that became hugely influential. And in 1992, she stopped showing and stopped going out and stopped participating and became this recluse of the New York art world, which just created more demand for her work and more mystique about her, to the point where her work that comes up at auction is the most expensive work by any living female artist in the world. Her name is Katie Noland, and her father was a well-known color-field abstract painter of the 60s named Kenneth Noland. And then Butch and the Red got involved with this guy named David, a lawyer, and they got married. They're still together. In the 80s, they bought into a small gallery in the East Village called Christminster. where Nan Golden and I both had solo shows. And Katie wanted to have one, but Butch offered a show because of her partner, who she was always having arguments with. Her partner, a painter named Stephen Algin, wanted to give a show to this artist named Dyke Blair. Katie and Dyke had been lovers, and they'd broken up in a bitter way. And Katie was furious that they were giving him a show, and she thought that Butch had betrayed her. So their relationship kind of fell apart with that. And her relationship with me and all the other people that we were friends with also sort of ended around 1987. And I haven't seen her since I happened to run into her in the late 80s. Nan Golden, of course, is another one that became huge. We had met when we were students in Boston. I was 20 and she was 18, and this is on her 28th birthday at her loft. And we were close. We had overlapping social circles. The last time we worked closely together was in 1990, when we created this slide project about AIDS that I wound up touring through the US and around the world. The irony about the kind of feeling of these pictures, which I find to be kind of sort of sweet, gentle, romantic, hopeful, is that it's 1981, and it's the year in which the first incidence of AIDS was reported in the New York Times. Nobody understood it. They didn't know what it was, but it was affecting gay men in particular. And a group of gay men got together in Larry Kramer's apartment and created the organization Gay Men's Health Crisis. In this picture, for instance, this man in the pink bathing suit, this guy next to him, and the guy in the gold t-shirt all died of AIDS. But for the people that are still alive that I'm in touch with, like Jody on the left, I've been doing interviews about that period for the book and taking excerpts to attach to the essay that I myself have written for it. The pictures are going to be printed the size that I got them back from the processor, like 4 by 6 inches, pretty small. And they're going to be 50 pictures in the book. It's funny because when I was organizing this show for Zurich last year, I chose 15 for that show because that's what would fit in her studio. And I remember my gallerist, who didn't know the work, said, well, how many are there that are good, that are worth showing or selling? And I was like, well, maybe, I don't know, I think I've picked all of them, maybe about 20. And then as I was working more on the book, developing it, it came to be 50. And some of them, even though I had little 4 by 6 prints for everything, there's some that I lost the prints of, and I didn't even remember what they looked like, and I got printed directly from the negative without even seeing a contact sheet. I made prints from the negatives, C prints, at a lab, and I would go into the lab throughout the summer and check the color and discuss that. About 5 of them were too difficult to print that way, and we had to do them digitally, scan them, and then make digital prints, because the color had shifted inconsistently through the negative. But most of them could be printed, and it was really exciting to do that. I printed them at 11 by 14. But after that year, I switched back to black and white mostly, because for me, the time of day that I most wanted to be photographing was at night, or this happens to be in the morning, but at times when there's low light. And although some of those color pictures are with low light, I didn't want to do a whole body of work in color and low light and have the same sort of muddy color. This is actually from the 90s. And by the late 80s, Kodak had created T-Max 3200 film, which I started using exclusively. It's grainier, but it has more latitude. Now, I would push that film and really be able to shoot in very low light situations. I think you can see a difference in this and the other pictures, and that the structure of the picture is little more complex. I like the feet over there in the left corner, like the use of the edge. It's a more radical loss of information for the sake of atmosphere. It's still like really interested in the figure and gesture. And it's a situation which I love with multiple figures because that just adds to the complexity. I like to use this as an example of talking about identifying with the subjects, projecting, not staging or posing, although this, I think, looks so precise and stylized that you'd think it was staged, but it was not. In creating this body of work, I developed really the fast reflexes of a street photographer so that I could get stuff like this. And it looks like there's a conflict between them. And in fact, in this situation, there was not, but within a month of this picture, they had broken up. So sometimes what the picture seems like is not what it was, but on a deeper level, maybe it is. This is a rare case in which I was photographing strangers, people that I didn't know. I went to this circuit party with this group of guys from Atlanta, and it was in Pensacola, Florida, in a place off a pier. People could go out to wander around on the pier. I took pictures inside of people dancing and all of that, but it was too dark and the situation was too congested, and I went outside on the pier and wandered around, and I've never felt so alienated. I mean, which is probably one reason I don't like to actually be a street photographer and photograph strangers, because it's very alienating to wander alone like that. And with all the pictures that I took that night of people, even getting as close as I did to these guys, I never had an interaction with them. Nobody ever asked me what I was doing or to explain myself. A few years later, when I was teaching in Italy for a year in Florence, and on one of the rare nights when I went out with my camera photographing strangers, I took this picture of these businessmen, which feels kind of ominous. And, I love these pictures, but I just don't have the energy to put myself in that kind of state of, I don't know, I think of as alienation. I think for people who do that, it's not so alienating, but I know it can be exhausting or lonely. And in terms of what things really were in the picture, I mean, I love this because it looks like she's holding a gun, and then in that kind of light, and actually it's a plate she's getting from the cabinet to set on the, and what's time, as I was visiting her name is Ariadna in Barcelona, in an apartment. Her mother was suffering from cancer in the bedroom, but the drama is not the one suggested by the photo. And where does this come from? My sense of, a femme fatale with a gun. I mean, I've asked myself that a lot. Where does this sort of darker themes and tones and feelings and emotions come from in my work? It has to do with the contrasts in my childhood growing up in rural Mississippi, the contrast between black and white people, income disparity, extreme income disparity. The first 9 years I lived in this little town in the Mississippi Delta, surrounded by plantations. And there was people in that town who were very, very rich. And then there were people in that town who were very, very poor. And it was a small town, so you felt all of it. And trying to synthesize that, make sense out of that as a worldview, I think, is one thing. I also grew up in a very macho family. Even the women were sort of, athletic and macho. My uncles were football players, my brother and all my cousins were. And something about that kind of male violence, that everyone hunted also. I didn't, but people in my family, my father was a big hunter. This is a situation in Berlin. There are two photographers. The woman on the left had a dinner party. I brought the man on the right. Even though they both lived in Berlin, I introduced them. They had both been to ICP in New York, but in different years, and they didn't know each other. And I could see that my friend Jonas on the right was falling in love with Tina. And we were among the last to leave, and I took a series of pictures of their goodbye. um, they did not get together. I think she already had a boyfriend. I don't remember that well. But there's Paula in the hotel that I've stayed in so many times. I love for its faded grandeur, those very high ceilings and balconies. And this also looks like an exchange between two people who know each other really well and have some sort of history. But actually, they may have met, but they didn't know each other that well, and they weren't meant to be there at the same time. I had asked each of them to come over to be photographed, but he came late and Paola came early, and they overlapped, which was good for me. And then I stepped back and made this picture. You can barely see that he has a cast on his arm, on his hand, because he sucked his hand into a wall at a party because of something his girlfriend said to him. So the thing about stepping back is that I think, you find your material, you figure out your approach, and then I think you need to have some sort of perspective on it. And literally, for me, stepping back in a picture is a kind of separating of oneself, but it also creates more space, and the space is space of context, which can feel like when you create this mood through the light and atmosphere, it feels like a psychological context. And whose context is it? Does it belong to Paola? Does it belong to Santiago? Does it belong to me? I mean, I feel like it's not just my projection, but in some way it's something that we're all sharing. But I don't call it a collaboration, because that frame is the frame of my perspective. And it's one of my favorite pictures. But basically what I came up with was just go to color and change the format. And I proceeded in the same mode, which is to photograph people that I know. And sometimes repetitively, like Paola has been someone that I've photographed over the years as one of the strongest female protagonists in my work. With color, again, you can see it's more difficult. Color doesn't have the latitude as that Timex 3200 black and white film. I push the color. I shoot 800 ASA film, and I push it, and I still am losing a lot of information, and it's kind of grainy. But I love that little detail of his belt and that little silver of the necklace, and I'd rather see those little abstractions of what he's wearing than see the whole thing. It's more mysterious and enigmatic. That kind of sense of enigma is something that's interesting to me in life, the things that aren't revealed, that we don't know, that we have to puzzle out. I mean, similarly here, this was the previous person's girlfriend, and the fact that we're not seeing her face, it's covered by her hair, and she's in her own little world doing her own thing. That separation between us is interesting to me. But for me, it's different, that separation with someone that I know versus the separation with a stranger, which just makes me feel too alienated to pursue. But color, I had to start photographing in color. I was going to Mexico and photographing, and this is in Argentina. And just, the color in Latin America was just so vibrant. I was like, how could I not be showing that? This is someone who had studied photography in New York. He hadn't actually been my student, but I knew him from School of Visual Arts. And when I was in Buenos Aires, I found out he was there also, and took this picture of him in his parents' apartment. And I love the color of that furniture and the pillows and the curtains. But, the window is like a black and white picture, and I kind of like that. So a few years ago, I got this residency in Rome for a year, and I had this huge studio for the first time. In New York, I don't have a studio. Now I have a designated room in my apartment that I use as a studio, but I had never really needed a studio because I photograph people in real locations, in their apartments or in my apartment, but not in a studio setting. So I had this big studio, and I had also gotten into buying and collecting paintings and drawings from eBay. And in Rome, there was a huge flea market that I started going to, and there was this great source for photographs. And I started going there often, and what happened a number of times, which was incredible to me, was that in sifting through these bags of found photos in the flea market, I came across whole collections of pictures. For instance, this one, these are all pictures pertaining to one Italian family in the late 30s and early 40s. Particularly, they're about the children in that family who were teenage and early 20s. This guy, the son, the oldest one, was a pilot for Mussolini, and he died in a crash. And I remember the night, after working with these photos for months and thinking about what I was going to do with them, I suddenly realized that there was some writing on the back of one that told that he died in a plane. And by that time, I felt like I'd come to know him. And it was devastating. It was as if somebody I knew had died, even though it was all so long ago. The fact that, I call them fighting on the wrong side was interesting to me too, that they were, he was fighting on the fascist side. Because growing up in Mississippi, I grew up on the wrong side. People, in my childhood, it was as if the Civil War had just happened. And, rampant racism as there is today. I mean, a really conservative place. And, I grew up hearing those values, which by the time I was a teenager, I began to reject and challenge. But also then that you have family who still believe in those things. I have the people in my life that I know the best who are Trump supporters are all in the South, and they are cousins and friends, and it's something I don't understand, but it made me think a lot about the American Civil War, and what happens when you love people whose belief systems are so different from your own. And life and death questions come into it. Anyway, I looked at these pictures a lot. I got them framed individually. I was also fascinated by old frames, and I found a source for old frames in that same flea market, and began to discover this narrative in the work that had to do with how close this brother and sister were, how close the brother was to another pilot, and how that pilot married the sister, and how there may have been this love relationship between those two men. I also found, amazingly enough, a packet of negatives of the brother. And I know all their first names, but I never could find the family name and track them down. But his name was Ennio. And the negatives were all of Ennio, all like this, like full figure, this intense connection with whoever's taking the picture. And I concluded, because there were an array of situations, including in military uniform, etc., that they had been taken by this close friend, the other pilot. Then I put them all together. And the purple glasses on a table is part of the piece too, because in my studio, as I was arranging this piece in Italy, I found these fabulous purple glasses in a thrift store, and I started putting them out as a kind of object for its color and for the mood of it, and tried different things out with it. But I realized that I liked it with the piece, so when I showed this piece, I included those purple glasses. And on the opposite wall, I don't have a picture to show you, but on the opposite wall are 7 prints that I made from the negatives of the pictures of Ennio. And in the same show, I did this other piece with another collection of pictures of one family. They're pictures of 2 sisters in Rome who were about my age, my generation, in the 50s, photographed by their parents all around Rome in front of landmarks and so on, and often dressed alike. Those are their parents. And, you know, I found about 90 of them. And as I realized, sifting through, that I was seeing the same family, I would put them aside. So this happened with about 8 collections of photos and all of them, you know, I intend to do pieces with. And each time I make these pieces, I change the terms somehow in terms of what I contribute to it. For instance, I had this idea that I wanted to photograph the 2 sisters today, and I found 2 women to make those pictures with, and they actually didn't know each other until I made the pictures with them. And one was living in Rome, and she's Italian. The other one is American and was living in Florence while I was living in Rome, just there for a year. And she actually identifies as male. She's a trans man, but she doesn't use he, her pronouns. When I was taking this picture, I was so into the fiction of this piece that it made me so sad. It was so poignant to me. It was just as if they really were the sisters coming together today. I mean, today they would be a little bit older than this, actually. But it really affected me. The idea, I guess the idea of it in this piece is the way in childhood people have such expectations for you and projections. They think they know what you're going to be, who you're going to be. And then, you know, sometimes that's not what happens. And in this case, those new pictures are the ones that are larger in the bigger frames. And instead of found frames, I got matching frames, but still individual frames. And then this is another piece that I made from pictures I found in the flea market in Rome. 2 of my former ICP students were in Italy, Danny and Eduardo. Eduardo is from Rome, and he was there several times in that year that I was in Rome, visiting his family, but they both live in New York. And they both had been to ICP the year before. And I curated a show that included them while I was in Rome, and so they were there for that. And Eduardo's family has a beach house off this peninsula called Argentario on the Mediterranean side of Italy. And he invited us up there for the weekend, and we went to this beach club that was just gorgeous, and I took pictures all day. And I also took iPhone pictures that are the smaller pictures that you see here of them, and also this other ICP person that lives in Italy. And when I got back to Rome, I went to the flea market and I found all these pictures of this guy over a 10-year span who was basically in the same place in Italy, off this little island near Argentario, and in some of the towns on that coast, like Sorrento, the Amalfi Coast. And he's almost always in a bathing suit or on a boat or in the water, but it's still like pictures over 10 years. And I thought, how perfect. That's how I'm going to use the pictures of Eduardo and Danny, is put them all together as if it's one continuum. And working this way has allowed me to, expand the sense of time in the work, and also the type of locations I can include. And it brings up this kind of intense sense of time and deja vu and family narrative, I guess. And in the same show that I did those in, I showed these color photographs that I made while I was in Italy. This is Eduardo's father. And we were at this kind of castle in the south of Italy where Eduardo, they were friends of the family, and Eduardo was having a show downstairs in a public room. And I was sleeping in a bedroom off this rooftop terrace. And around noon, everybody came to the terrace for drinks. And I was photographing all of that, but Eduardo's father, who is in construction, was going off taking these calls. And there was just something about him that just felt like he was this character out of one of those early 60s films. And in fact, there is this film by Godard called, in English it's called Contempt, with Brigitte Bardot, and a lot of it takes place on a rooftop of this kind of modernist mansion. This is Danny. When I went to Rome, I had to give them a proposal to get that residency, and the proposal was to take the feeling of intimacy that I had been exploring in interiors and rooms, and to take it outside somewhere, onto the terrace, into the garden, even into parks, to see if I could create a sense of intimacy, in the landscape. And this is a picture that I took of strangers again, that rare thing for me, in which early in the morning I went out in this town on the Amalfi Coast, walking the pier and photographing. And these guys were diving off this pier, and I never talked to them. They never talked to me. They never seemed bothered by what I was doing. I got quite close, as you can see. It looks really posed, but it's not. And again, it's that opportunity to see the figure and gesture and all that reveals and suggests, against a kind of abstract ground where they really stand out, like being at the beach. When I was doing a talk about this show last summer, summer before last, somebody said, "Why didn't you take more pictures like this?" It just goes back to that thing. I'm not comfortable in that mode, like trying to take pictures of strangers. It's not that I disapprove of it, it's just what my psychology is. I'm more comfortable like this with someone that I know. And this is this young woman from Serbia who was in Rome studying political science. And she came into a small dinner party I was at. And she was just so striking that I asked her if I could photograph her, and she said yes, and she came over to the academy, and I took this picture over there. 6 months later, I traveled to Serbia and a couple of other countries in Eastern Europe, and she had moved back, and I wanted to photograph her where she lived, and I did more. And now I'm making some wall pieces about Eastern Europe and Russia from things that I've collected there.